Tell me about a time you communicated a risk to stakeholders. Introduction. This is a common behavioral interview question for software developers, backend developers, senior developers, full-stack developers, and team leads. Interviewers ask this question to understand: check how you identify risks early. Check how you communicate technical risks clearly. Check how you explain impact to non-technical stakeholders. Check how you avoid surprises close to release. Check how you provide options instead of only problems. Check how you help stakeholders make informed decisions. Check how you balance delivery, quality, and business needs. This question is especially important for Java developers, backend developers, Spring Boot developers, full-stack developers, senior software developers, team leads, agile teams, system design interviews. The best way to answer this question is by using the STAR method. STAR means S, situation, explain the background. T, task, explain your responsibility. A, action, explain what you personally did. R, result, explain the final outcome. A good interview answer usually spends 10% situation, 10% task, 60% action, 20% result. The most important part is the action section, because interviewers want to understand how you explain the risk, what options you gave, and how you helped the team respond. Question: tell me about a time you communicated a risk to stakeholders. Example 1. Communicating release risk due to unclear requirements situation. In one sprint, we were building a new customer profile update feature. During development, I noticed that the acceptance criteria did not clearly define which fields were editable by normal users and which fields were admin only. Task: I was responsible for communicating the requirement risk to the product owner, QA, and Scrum Master before development went too far. Action: I first reviewed the story and identified the unclear areas. The unclear areas included required fields, optional fields, admin-only fields, validation messages, authorization rules, error scenarios, audit requirements. Then I explained the risk in simple business terms. I said that if we implemented the rules based on assumptions, users might be allowed to update fields they should not update, or QA might test against a different expectation. I also explained the possible impact: rework during QA, delayed sprint completion, inconsistent user experience, security or authorization issues, higher defect risk. Instead of only raising the problem, I suggested a solution. I proposed a short meeting with the product owner and QA to confirm the rules. During the meeting, we clarified the acceptance criteria and updated the story. Result: the team avoided building the wrong behavior. QA had clear test scenarios. The feature was delivered with fewer defects because the risk was communicated early. Why this answer works? This answer is strong because it shows early risk identification, stakeholder communication, requirement clarification, product owner and QA collaboration, security awareness, preventing rework. Example 2. Communicating performance risk before release situation. In one project, we were preparing to release a new search API. The API worked functionally, but during testing with larger data volume, response time became slow for broad searches. Task: I needed to communicate the performance risk to the product owner and team before release. Action: I first gathered evidence instead of raising a vague concern. I collected TAP, response time metrics, slow query details, sample request scenarios, database execution plan, expected production data volume, impact on user experience. Then I explained the risk in simple terms. I said that the feature worked, but if users performed broad searches in production, the page could load slowly and create unnecessary database load. I presented options: release as is with known performance risk, limit broad searches using required filters, add pagination and maximum page size, optimize the query, and add indexes before release. Release the feature in phases. I recommended adding pagination, maximum page size, and a database index before release. I also explained that this would reduce production risk without changing the business behavior. Result: the stakeholders agreed to address the performance risk before release. We added pagination and indexing. The API response time improved, and the release went out with better confidence. Why this answer works? This answer is good because it shows check performance risk communication, check evidence-based explanation, check stakeholder-friendly language, check options and recommendation, check database optimization, release confidence. Example 3. Communicating dependency risk from another team situation. In one sprint, our feature depended on an API from another internal team. The other team's API was not yet stable in the lower environment, and our integration testing was blocked. Task: I needed to communicate the dependency risk early so stakeholders understood the possible impact on the sprint timeline. Action: I first confirmed the current status with the other team. Then I documented what was blocked. The blocked areas included real API integration testing, error response validation, timeout behavior, security header testing, end-to-end QA testing. In stand-up and sprint risk discussion, I explained that development could continue using mock responses, but final integration testing depended on the other team's API availability. I communicated the risk clearly. Check: current development was not fully blocked. Integration testing was at risk. QA timeline could be affected. Release confidence would be lower without real endpoint testing. I proposed a mitigation plan. Check: use mock responses for development. Define the API contract clearly. Create integration tests ready to run. Schedule a sync with the other team. Track the dependency daily. Prepare fallback plan if endpoint remained unavailable. Result: stakeholders had early visibility into the dependency risk. The Scrum Master helped coordinate with the other team. When the endpoint became available, we were ready to test quickly because the contract and test cases were already prepared. Why this answer works? This answer is strong because it shows dependency risk communication, cross-team coordination, mitigation planning, agile transparency, integration testing awareness, delivery ownership. Example 4. Communicating security risk in an admin feature situation. In one project, we were building a new admin API that allowed users to update configuration values. During review, I noticed that the front end restricted the admin screen, but the backend API did not yet enforce admin-only access. Task: I needed to communicate the security risk to the product owner and development team clearly and quickly. Action: I explained the risk without using alarming language. I said that hiding the admin screen in the front end was helpful, but it was not enough security. If someone called the backend API directly, the backend still needed to verify whether the user had admin permission. I explained the impact: unauthorized configuration changes, production behavior changes, audit and compliance concerns, potential support issues, loss of trust in admin controls. Then I proposed the fix. The backend needed authentication check, admin role authorization, service layer permission check, audit logging, unauthorized and forbidden responses, tests for admin and non-admin access. I also explained that this was important enough to fix before release, not as a later improvement. Result: the team agreed to block release until backend authorization was added. We implemented admin role checks and audit logging. The feature was released securely, and the same backend authorization pattern was reused later. Why this answer works? This answer is good because it shows security risk communication, hashtag backend authorization knowledge, hashtag explaining risk simply, hashtag protecting production, audit awareness, hashtag strong judgment. Example 5. Communicating data migration risk situation. In one project, we needed to migrate customer records from an old data model to a new data model. During analysis, I noticed that some old records had missing values, duplicate identifiers, and status values that did not clearly map to the new model. Task: I was responsible for communicating the data migration risk to the product owner, business team, and QA. Action. I first analyzed sample records and grouped the risky cases. The risky cases included missing required fields, duplicate records, old status values without clear mapping, inactive customers, records needing manual review, invalid date values. Then I explained the risk in business terms. I said, if we migrated the data without validation, some records could be migrated incorrectly, skipped silently, or create incorrect behavior in the new system. I proposed a safer migration approach. Check. Create a mapping document. Check. Review unclear mappings with business users. Check. Validate records before migration. Check. Skip invalid records with clear reason. Check. Generate an error report. Check. Run a test migration first. Allow business review before final migration. I also worked with QA to define validation checks after the test migration. Result. The business team helped clarify the mapping rules. The test migration identified records that needed correction. The final migration was more reliable because risky data was reviewed before production migration. Why this answer works? This answer is strong because it shows data migration risk, business stakeholder communication, validation strategy, error reporting, test migration, preventing bad data. Example 6. Communicating timeline risk due to hidden complexity situation. In one sprint planning session, a report feature looked simple at first. The product owner expected it to be completed quickly, but after reviewing the story, I noticed hidden complexity in calculation rules, date filtering, and export behavior. Task. I needed to communicate the timeline risk before the team committed to an unrealistic sprint scope. Action. I reviewed the requirement and identified the hidden complexity. The complexity included calculation rules, date range behavior, time zone handling, large data volume, export logic, user role restrictions, QA test data requirements, report accuracy validation. I explained to the product owner that the feature was not just a simple UI report. The backend needed to calculate accurate totals, handle edge cases, and support QA validation using business test data. Then I proposed splitting the work. The first story would include Action Calculation API, Basic UI Display, Validation with Sample Data. The second story would include Export Functionality, Advanced Filters, Additional Formatting. Result. The product owner agreed to split the story. The team made a more realistic sprint commitment. The first version was delivered successfully, and the remaining work was planned properly. Why this answer works? This answer is good because it shows timeline risk communication, hidden complexity analysis, scope splitting, product owner alignment, realistic planning, delivery maturity. Example 7. Communicating production deployment risk situation. In one release, a teammate wanted to deploy a change late in the day because the code was ready. The change affected a critical customer-facing API and included database update logic. Task. I needed to communicate the deployment risk to the team and stakeholders. Action. I acknowledged that the code was ready and that everyone wanted to keep momentum. Then I explained the risk. The change affected critical API flow, database update behavior, downstream service call, customer-facing functionality, rollback complexity. I explained that deploying late in the day meant less support coverage if something went wrong. Instead of just saying no, I proposed a safer plan. The safer plan included C. Deploy the next morning. C. Prepare deployment checklist. C. Confirm rollback steps. C. Prepare smoke test scenarios. C. Monitor API response time and error rate. C. Keep team support available after deployment. I also explained that this was not about delaying progress. It was about making sure we could respond quickly if there was an issue. Result. The team agreed to deploy the next morning. The deployment went smoothly. The stakeholders appreciated the risk-based recommendation because it protected users and reduced support risk. Why this answer works? This answer is strong because it shows: check, deployment risk communication, production judgment, support coverage awareness, rollback planning, stakeholder communication, release safety. Example 8. Communicating technical debt risk situation. In one project, the team had duplicate validation logic across several services. The code worked, but I noticed that every new change required updates in multiple places. Task. I needed to communicate the technical debt risk to the product owner and team so we could plan a small refactor. Action. I explained the risk in simple terms. I said that the feature worked today, but because the same rule existed in multiple places, a future rule change could be missed in one location. That could lead to inconsistent behavior and more QA defects. I explained the impact. Slower future changes, higher chance of bugs, more regression testing, inconsistent validation behavior, harder onboarding for new developers. I proposed a small refactoring task instead of a large rewrite. The plan was, well, identify duplicate validation rules, move common rules into shared validator, add unit tests, update affected services, run regression tests, document the new pattern. Result. The product owner agreed to include a small technical debt task. After the refactor, validation logic was easier to maintain. Future changes became faster and safer. Why this answer works? This answer is good because it shows: technical debt risk communication, business impact explanation, small refactor planning, maintainability thinking, avoiding future defects, stakeholder alignment. Best short answer version. If you need a short interview answer, you can say, in one project, we were preparing to release a new customer search API. Functionally, the API worked, but during testing with larger data volume, I noticed that broad searches were slow and could create heavy database load in production. I communicated this risk to the product owner and team using evidence instead of just raising a general concern. I shared response time metrics, the slow query behavior, and examples of broad search requests. I explained the risk in simple terms. Users might see slow page loads during peak traffic, and the database could be affected if many users performed broad searches at the same time. I also provided options. We could release as is with known risk, require filters, add pagination and maximum page size, or optimize the query and add indexes before release. I recommended adding pagination and indexing before release because it reduced risk without changing the business behavior. As a result, stakeholders agreed to address the issue before release. The API response time improved, and we released with better confidence. Common mistakes to avoid. 1. Raising a risk without evidence. Bad answer. I told them the feature might be risky. Better answer. I shared response time metrics, data volume estimates, and examples of risky scenarios. 2. Only giving problems, not options. Bad answer. I told stakeholders we could not release. Better answer. I explained the risk and gave options with impact and recommendation. 3. Using too much technical jargon. Bad answer. The query execution plan showed a full table scan and index cardinality issue. Better answer. I explained that the database had to scan too many records, which could make the page slow for users. 4. Waiting too long. Bad answer. I raised the risk at the end of the sprint. Better answer. I raised the risk early so the product owner and QA could adjust scope and testing. 5. Sounding negative. Bad answer. This will fail if we release. Better answer. There is a risk under high usage, and here are the options to reduce it before release. Best practices for answering this question. Use the STAR method. Explain the risk clearly. Share evidence. Explain business impact. Avoid unnecessary jargon. Give options. Recommend a path. Explain mitigation plan. Communicate early. End with the result. What interviewers are looking for. Interviewers want to see whether you can C. Identify risks early. C. Communicate clearly with stakeholders. C. Explain technical impact in business terms. C. Avoid surprises. C. Provide options and recommendations. C. Balance delivery and quality. C. Protect users and production systems. C. Collaborate with product owner, QA, and business teams. For senior roles, they also want to see C. Risk ownership, stakeholder management, production judgment, release readiness thinking, architecture trade-off communication, business impact awareness, decision-making maturity. Strong words to use in your answer. You can use words like check identified, check communicated, check explained, quantified, check clarified, escalated appropriately, proposed options, recommended, mitigated, aligned, documented, reduced risk, protected release quality. Example: I communicated the risk by explaining the technical issue in business terms, sharing evidence, presenting options, recommending a mitigation plan, and aligning stakeholders before the release. Good stakeholder risk topics you can use. Depending on your experience, you can talk about unclear requirements risk, performance risk before release, dependency risk from another team, security risk in admin API, data migration risk, timeline risk due to hidden complexity, production deployment risk, technical debt risk, QA regression risk, external API dependency risk, database migration risk, release readiness risk, scalability risk, monitoring gap risk, integration testing risk. Final summary. Tell me about a time you communicated a risk to stakeholders is an important interview question, because software developers must identify risks early and help stakeholders make informed decisions. The best answer should include what risk you identified, why it mattered, who the stakeholders were, what evidence you had, how you explained the risk clearly, what options you provided, what mitigation plan you recommended, what decision was made. Good examples include COC, unclear requirements risk, performance risk, dependency risk, security risk, data migration risk, timeline risk, deployment risk, technical debt risk. The strongest answers show ownership, clear communication, business impact awareness, practical options, and risk reduction.